To kick things off, please welcome Skift Senior Vice President of Research, Haixia Wang.
Thanks, Rafa. Thanks, Brian. Welcome to Skift Sustainable Tourism Summit, everyone. As Rafa mentioned, in the next 3 hours, we will hear expert discussions on sustainable tourism in all 3 areas of ESG. Brian, if you can go to the next slide, that would be great. Yeah. So that's environmental, social, and the governance, of course. But for my presentation, I will only focus on the E part, and specifically how we should take actions in reducing carbon emissions in the tourism industry. So before I start, if I start to cough historically, please bear with me. I'm recovering from COVID, so still coughing a lot. The bottom line is really to align with the Paris Agreement of a 1.5 degrees Celsius target. We need to take a much deeper action, decarbonize the entire value chain urgently. Next slide, please. So first, let's take a look at the positive side. Of course, more and more travel companies are already making deeper commitments for carbon reductions, especially the world's biggest and most influential companies. So as of now, sorry, I'm getting a little bit there. The slide, the one before this. Yeah, this one first. So we need to take a look at this, and this is very important. As of now, we can see the world 5 of the world's largest airline companies and 2 of the world's 6 largest hotel companies have already joined UN's Race to Zero campaign and committed to setting rigorous carbon reduction targets. And then the next slide, please. Similarly, so all these airlines and the hotels, except one, have got the science-based targets initiative approvals for their targets and commitments. We all know that that's the highest existing standard for target setting and measurement. Next one, please. And all these companies have also been reporting to CDP on their climate change action for at least the past 3 years. So I will see a couple of C's here. 4 companies received A- in CDP's ratings of environmental actions. So climate commitment, we all know this part also is increasingly driven by consumer demand. So this is from both the corporate travel as well as the consumer leisure travel side. For instance, Marriott disclosed in their filings that in 2019, $3 billion worth of corporate business contract with Marriott required the provision of carbon water footprints data, and 60% of IHG's corporate clients request sustainability information also. And in our recent survey that we conducted in December last year, we conducted a survey in 5 major travel markets. Over half of consumers in all these countries said it's important for travel companies to adopt a sustainability practice. Next slide, please. So it looks like we're on the right track, but is it enough? So now let's look at the other side, the dark side. So when we look at the promise made, the one before this, please, we only use the world's largest companies as examples, so you can see that. And how about the long tail? So out of the 1,100 plus airlines globally, only 10 joined the Race to Zero campaign. And the hotel industry is exponentially more fragmented than the airline industry. So there are over 400,000 hotel companies globally, so only 20 joined Race to Zero. Next slide. And this is a quote from a study hotel chain sustainability practice in Spain. So most medium and small-sized hotel managers interviewed echoed this quote. So with limited spending budget and a focus on revenues, sustainability is not a priority for most of them. Next, please. So, that's the skill. Skill is a huge challenge for us. Now, let's look at the actual action by companies. In fact, despite what many companies claim, in general, reduction targets are often too low to reach the 1.5-degree targets. In the next couple of slides, let's look at it. Again, aviation and hotels. So for aviation, to align with the global target, so basically by 2050, the industry needs to reduce net CO2 emissions to half of what they were in 2005. So in a report we published last year, we analyzed the CO2 reduction records of the 6 largest airlines. So total emissions had consistently increased, actually from 2016 to 2019, even though the intensity went down, but travel is growing. So the absolute emissions were growing, and we're basically at 0.0 in 2019 for the 50% reduction goal. Now let's look at the hotels. Very similar. So hotels needed to reduce emissions per room per year by 66% by 2030 from 2010 levels. We did a similar analysis for the largest hotels. So the numbers are hard to see there, but the average annual reduction target for the global hotel brands is about 3% and also it's from various base years. So just a simple math here, it's not going to be enough. Next slide, please. So another point to that is, again, these are the world's largest, best funded companies. If their targets are too low, I think about the long tail that we mentioned earlier. So this is, excuse me, the next two. All right, I'm good. Thanks, Brian. And the next two common practices, basically, I'm going to talk about, that further limits the industry's climate mitigation actions. So I'm sure everyone is familiar with this graph, right? This is the framework set by GHG protocols to measure and manage companies' emissions. And we know the top of contention is the scope 3 emissions. So next slide, please. According to SBTi guidelines, so if a company's relevant scope 3 emissions are 40% or more of total scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, scope 3 must be included in the near-term science-based targets. And regardless of the size of scope 3 emissions, all companies should include emissions from all relevant scope 3 categories in long-term science-based categories targets. So we know for airlines, hotels, they have a very unique situation in terms of scope 3. For airlines, their main business, of course, is built upon burning fuel. Give me 1 second. Sorry about that. So then if they purchase the fuel from a third party, that's considered a scope 3 emissions. And many airlines don't report that, so let alone working on reducing emissions associated with it. For hotels, the franchise properties are considered as a scope 3 as well. With the asset-light model, franchised hotels account for a lion's share for most major hotel brands. So failing to track or setting less stringent environmental goals for these franchise rooms, it means a huge gap in the industry's emission reduction efforts. So now let's look at the second practice. This is called carbon offsetting. The one for this, the first often misleading practice is the company participation in the carbon credits markets. So this is again from the SBTI guideline, right? So the use of carbon credits must not be counted as emission reductions towards the progress of a company's near-term or long-term science-based targets. So it can only consider as an option for neutralizing residual emission or finance additional climate mitigation. So it's very clear. So companies can't count carbon credits in their reduction targets. Next slide. So this should apply to most of the other carbon offsetting practices. So the reason is that while these offsetting practices might reduce emissions significantly in the long term, with a very large scale financial investment and technical advancements, none of them has substantial carbon reduction impact at the moment, and that they shouldn't be counted again towards a company's own reduction targets. So last slide. What's next? This is what we're going to talk about today. Get real, avoid loopholes, be ambitious and aggressive, work together. So we're going to talk about that today, right? The entire value chain, the entire tourism journey, and various stakeholders. And then lastly, invest. This is the biggest demystification. It's not a cost. It's the most economical investment for the next generation companies. Thank you very much. We enjoyed the rest of the discussions.